and gentlemen, today the United Nations measures its strength against various challenges. The decision-making impasse in Security Council, the situation in which Russia, one of the permanent members of the Council, is deliberately violating the UN Charter. The lengthy debates are considered as symptom of the weakness of both the organization and its constituent states. There are some people who ask questions about whether the UN is needed at all. Does it fit the times? On behalf of Poland, a neighbor of attacked Ukraine, a country that has taken in millions of refugees, I emphatically answer, yes, the United Nations is very much needed. No better but by bringing aid and assistance to those most in need, children, victims of war, the persecuted and the hungry, every day, all over the world. In 2025, the UN will celebrate 80 years of its existence. We remember why it was founded. Today, in these dangerous times, we need a return to the thinking and the actions of the founding fathers of the United Nations. There will be no lasting peace without cooperation, without solidarity between richer and poorer countries, and ultimately without respect for international law.
This court, His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Miguel Díaz-Canel.
President, I am bringing to this assembly the voice of the South, the exploited and humiliated, as was said by Che Guevara in this same room almost 60 years ago. We are a diverse group of nations sharing the same problems. We have just confirmed that in Havana, which was honored to host the summit of leaders and other high representatives of the G77 in China, which is the most representative, broad, and diverse representation that exists in the multilateral arena. During those two virtually tireless days, more than 100 representatives from 134 nations making up the group raised their voices to call for changes that can no longer be postponed in the midst of this unjust, irrational, and abusive international economic order that year after year has deepened the enormous inequalities between a minority of well-developed nations and a majority that has not managed to get rid of the euphemism of developing nations. Worse still, as was recognized by the United Nations Secretary General at the Havana Summit, the G77 was founded 6 decades ago to repair centuries of injustice and abandonment. And in today's convulsive world, they are entangled in a host of world crises, where poverty is on the rise and hunger is even greater. We are united by the need to change, which has not been resolved, and by the condition of being the main victims of the current global multidimensional crisis, abusive unequal exchange, scientific and technological gaps, and the degradation of the environment. But we are also united, and have been for more than half a century now, by the inescapable challenge and the determination to transform the current international order, which, as well as being exclusionary and irrational, is unsustainable for the planet and is not viable for the well-being of all. The countries represented at the G77 and China, where more than 80% of the population lives, do not only have the challenge of development, they also have the responsibility of modifying those structures which marginalize us from social progress and turn many peoples of the South into laboratories for renewed forms of domination. A new and more just global contract is imperative. President, only 7 years ahead of the deadline established to implement the promising 2030 agenda, the panorama is bleak. This august institution has already recognized it. At the current pace, none of the 17 SDGs will be achieved, and over half of the 169 agreed targets will not be met. In the midst of the 21st century, the fact that almost 800 million people suffer from hunger in a planet that produces enough to feed all is outrageous. Equally outrageous is the fact that in the era of knowledge and accelerated development of ICTs, more than 760 million people, 2/3 of them women, do not know how to read or write. The efforts of developing countries are not enough to implement the 2030 Agenda. They must be supported by concrete actions to provide access to markets and demand financial institutions in which our countries have true decision-making capacity and access to financing. A recapitalization of multilateral development banks is imperative to radically improve their lending conditions and to meet the financial needs of the South. The member countries of this group were forced to allocate $379 billion from their reserves to protect their currencies in 2022. Almost twice as much the amount of special drawing rights allocated to them by the IMF. A rationalization, review, and change of role of credit qualifying agencies is needed. Equally imperative is to establish criteria that would go beyond the GDP.
Who might not be aware of it, what this WHO international treaty that's currently being ironed out over at the UN, what is it all about?
Well, the key points are that with the support of the financial institutions of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the Gates Foundation, we're essentially ceding the ability to suspend all civil liberties and all of the rights associated with what we would call the Bill of Rights here in the United States, International Declaration of Human Rights. All of those can be suspended by a capricious determination that there's a public health emergency, and the minute that happens, there are no rights. In a nutshell, that's what the treaty is. And like the PrEP Act was after the anthrax outbreak of 2001, which the U.S. perpetrated on the U.S. so that we could get to the PrEP Act of 2005, the exact same playbook is how we got COVID to get us to this moment, which is to say, terrorize the world, convince them that we need some giant protector state that actually has some sort of supranational ability, and then suspend civil liberties as long as they need to be suspended. And in this particular case, at the whim of funding agencies who have no criminal accountability. So, in a nutshell, if you feel good about that, feel good about May. What it does is it allows a board at the World Health Organization to either declare an actual emergency or declare an anticipated emergency. There doesn't have to be any evidence. There is no evidence standard at all. So this is actually worse than what happened in COVID, because they don't even have a standard that says they have to isolate a pathogen. They don't have to isolate anything. What they have to do is simply say, we think that there is a reason to declare an emergency, and as such, we therefore have the ability to suspend travel, to actually penalize member states. There's a very big clause inside of the treaty that actually has penalties on member states for noncompliance. But we have to go back to the formation of the World Health Organization, and a lot of people don't want to go back to 1944 to 1946 when the WHO was set up. Very few people know that they wrote absolute immunity from all criminal prosecution into their charter. The only organization self-appointed with no external authority ever granted to have the ability to write themselves out of all forms of criminal prosecution in perpetuity. That's right in the charter of the World Health Organization. And that right, which was actually negotiated by the Wellcome Trust and the Rockefeller Foundation, they are the ones that paid for it. They're the ones that put Renee Sand up as the first director. They're the ones that actually put all of these pieces in place. Give them the ability to act with impunity on citizens, regardless of your compliance or absence of compliance with any of the nation-state decisions around the World Health Organization. Every American citizen traveling abroad has no rights. They can be subject to any crime for which there can be no criminal prosecution. So if you feel good about that, yeah, there's probably a way we can actually soft pedal this thing. But the problem is, like we had with anthrax to get to the PrEP Act, like we've had with COVID to get to the World Health Organization treaty, These things are set up to be terror campaigns to modify the public's willingness to give up their liberties.